The ground in Castro County had been dying since March. By the first week of July 1963, the soil in Emmett Carver's northeast field had cracked open in long parallel fractures, running from the edge of the irrigation ditch all the way to the fence line. Some of them 3 inches wide, some so deep that when a man pushed his fingers into them, he could not find the bottom. The topsoil had gone the color of ash and lifted in the afternoon wind in slow, weightless sheets that carried nothing of value anywhere. At the base of the largest cracks, when a man crouched close enough to look, the earth showed the pale, desiccated color of old bone. The sorghum along the irrigation margin had begun to lean at odd angles, its lower leaves curling inward, the way leaves curl when a plant has made a calculation about its own survival and decided to conserve what little it has left. Emmett Carver was standing at the edge of that field at 4:47 in the morning, when the idea that had been waiting patiently at the back of his mind for 12 years finally moved to the front. I was 61 years old. He had worked this same 340 acres since the spring of 1931, when his father Ezra handed him the tractor key and told him to finish the south pasture before supper. 32 years on this particular ground had built in Emmett a kind of knowledge that did not come from textbooks or county extension bulletins or any other man's instruction. It came from the way the soil smelled at 8 inches in April, when the subsoil moisture was right and when it was not. It came from the exact pitch the wind made when it came down off the caprock, carrying nothing behind it. It came from paying attention to the same piece of earth, season after season, decade after decade, until the earth stopped being a location and became something closer to a language he had spent his adult life learning to read. There were men in this county who farmed more acres. There were men who farmed with newer equipment and better credit terms and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been genuinely close to losing everything. Emmett had none of those advantages and had never particularly wanted them. What he had was the ground and the knowledge of it, and on most years that had been sufficient. This was not shaping into most years. He crouched in the pre-dawn dark and pressed his right hand flat against the largest crack he could find near the irrigation ditch. The earth broke away in his palm like dry cornmeal. No grit, no structure, no moisture at any depth he could reach. He stood and pressed his palm against his jeans to clean it. He pulled the small green notebook from his shirt pocket and wrote by the pale light of a sky that had not yet decided to become morning. Knee field, day 14. Crack depth, 3 inches. No moisture to 8 inches. He put the notebook away. He looked at the horizon to the east, where the darkness was just beginning to separate from the land in a thin gray seam. Nothing in it suggested rain. Nothing in it suggested anything except another day of the same heat, pressing down on the same dry ground, with the same indifference it had maintained since the last week of February, when the last meaningful moisture had fallen across this part of the Texas Panhandle, and the sky had closed itself up like a book no one was going to be permitted to read again for a while. When he turned back toward the house, Mabel was standing in the kitchen doorway. She held a coffee cup in both hands and had not drunk from it. She did not call to him or raise a hand. She stood in the rectangle of kitchen light and watched him walk back across the yard, and by the time he reached the door, she had set his cup on the counter and moved to the far side of the kitchen. They did not speak about what he had found out there. They had not spoken about the field in 3 weeks, not because there was nothing to say, but because neither of them had found the place to begin saying it. 3 weeks of suppers eaten mostly in silence of Mabel, looking out the window at the sky the way a person looks at something they have been watching for a long time, without result of Emmett coming in after dark and washing up at the kitchen sink and eating what had been kept warm on the stove without sitting down first, as if sitting down would constitute an acknowledgement of something he was not yet prepared to acknowledge. The coffee was hot. He drank it standing at the counter. Outside, the first pale light was beginning to separate the barn roof from the sky. Frank Decker arrived before 8 that morning in a pickup that needed a new muffler pulling into the yard. With the reluctance of a man who already knows what he is about to deliver, he was the well driller out of the neighboring county, compact and direct, with the kind of sun-darkened face that comes from 20 years of standing in open fields, looking down into the earth for a living. He had learned long ago that delay cost everyone more than the news itself. But he sat in the cab for a moment anyway and looked at the northeast field before he opened the door. Some news warranted a moment of preparation, even when preparation changed nothing. He told Emmett what he had come to say. The Ogallala aquifer beneath this section of the county had dropped 11 feet in 2 seasons. The static water level was close enough now to the operational floor of the existing pump that another dry year, which this was already shaping into, would put the water table below what the machine could reach. Drilling deeper and replacing the pump would cost $2,200. He said it plainly without apology, the way a doctor names a thing, because naming it is the only honest option available. Emmett listened without interrupting or looking away from the field. When Decker finished, neither man said anything for a moment. Decker said that sorghum is going to be gone in 10 days without water. Emmett said, "I know that." Decker nodded once. He did not ask about the money because a man who had been drilling wells in agricultural counties for 2 decades understood which questions did not get asked at a farm gate. He got back in the truck and drove out the way he came, the bad muffler audible on the flat road. Long after the truck itself was gone, the sound fading into the distance until the morning was quiet again, and the quiet was worse than the sound had been. Emmett stood at the gate and went through the arithmetic he had already done 20 times that week because going through it again was more productive than standing still. $2,200 for the pump was not available. What was present and due was a $14,000 operating note at First Cattleman's Bank secured against the land due in full on October 15th. The sorghum on 60 acres would be dead inside 10 days. Without a harvestable crop, the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings. The Carver name had been on this land since 1908. Emmett knew exactly what foreclosure looked like. He had watched it happen to 2 other families on this road in his lifetime. He had watched the final loads go into the trucks, and the trucks pull out, and the land transfer to other hands, and the original names come off the mailboxes and not go back on. He had watched the way those families moved afterward, with a particular quality of diminishment that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the severing of something that had taken generations to build. He understood that it was not an abstract outcome. It was a specific and permanent one, and it arrived with a completeness from which no subsequent good fortune could entirely recover a man. I went inside and told Mabel he was going into town. She was standing at the kitchen window with her back to the door. She said, "All right." He drove the 12 miles to the county seat under a sky that was already the flat, merciless white of high summer. By 9 in the morning, the kind of sky that does not simply withhold rain, but seems to have considered the possibility of rain and rejected it on principle. The road ran straight through land that was doing the same thing. His field was doing the same crack patterns visible in every pasture and planted section. He passed the same airless yellow quality to the vegetation that had not yet given up, but was getting close. The Castro County Agricultural Extension Office sat in a modest brick building on the main street with a sun-bleached flag out front and a parking lot with 3 pickups already in it when he arrived. The waiting area held 3 wooden chairs. Hank Monroe occupied the chair nearest the window, a large sunburned man who ran 600 dry-farmed acres on the Fiona Road, sitting with his hat on his knee, and the patient expression of someone who had already heard what he came to hear. and was working on accepting it. Wade Slater sat against the opposite wall with a folded piece of paper in his hand that he was not reading his eyes. On the middle distance, a man calculating something. Both men looked up when Emmett came in. Monroe nodded. Slater looked back at his paper. Gordon Briggs called Emmett in after 15 minutes. Briggs was 43 years old, a Texas A&M graduate, and had been running the extension desk in this county for 11 years. He was not a cruel man. He was something more difficult than cruel. He was certain. Certain of what the data said. Certain of what the programs allowed. Certain of what a man in Emmett's position needed to understand and accept. His certainty was not born of malice, but of long experience with outcomes. And in 11 years he had seen enough failed gambles and misread seasons to have developed a thorough confidence in the boundaries of what was possible. His desk held the stacked paperwork of a summer that was breaking records in all the wrong directions. Drought reports, set-aside applications, failed loan requests, organized in neat folders by date of receipt. A man who organized things that carefully had already stopped expecting surprises. One of those folders was open on the corner of the desk. A county-wide drought report, its cover sheet listing the producers who had already filed set-aside applications. From where Emmett sat, he could read the top of the first page without difficulty. He laid out the situation for Briggs clearly, and in sequence the aquifer dropped the failed irrigation on 60 acres of sorghum, the 10-day timeline before the crop died beyond recovery. He asked about emergency assistance through the USDA's Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Service. Briggs pulled the standard ASCS form from a drawer and placed it on the desk. He said the minimum processing time for a drought relief application in this county is 14 weeks. The sorghum would be dead in 10 days. Emmett looked at the form and said nothing. Briggs leaned back and said with aquifer levels what they are this season. I don't see what crop you think you can put in that ground. The extension recommendation for producers in your position is to fallow the affected acreage and apply for set-aside payments. It is not a perfect solution, but it is the available one. Emmett said set-aside pays approximately $246 on 60 acres. Briggs folded his hands on the desk. That's correct. Emmett said my note is $14,000. Briggs said that's between you and the bank. Through the door that was not quite closed, Hank Monroe in the waiting area had heard the entire exchange. He shifted in his chair. He did not lean forward. He just shifted the small movement of a man absorbing information he expected and found confirming. Slater still did not look up, but the piece of paper in his hands had gone still. Emmett looked at the open folder on the corner of Briggs' desk. He read the name at the top of the set-aside application list. Grady Locke. Application date July 8th, 3 days earlier. He sat with that for a moment. Locke had filed 3 days before this meeting, which meant Locke had known or believed with high confidence that Emmett was not going to file, which meant the information about the aquifer situation, about Frank Decker's visit, about the 60 acres of dying sorghum had traveled from somewhere to somewhere and had reached Grady Locke before any of it appeared in any official form in this office. The route that information had taken was not difficult to trace, and Raymond Holden at First Cattleman's Bank, who maintained regular contact with the county's larger operators about the condition of their smaller neighbors, might already have received his own version of the same information, might already be running his own calculations about the Carver note and what October 15th would look like, and might already be having conversations with men who had expressed interest in certain acreage at certain prices. Emmett picked up the ASCS form from the desk. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set it back down neatly directly in front of Briggs, the way a man places something he has decided he will not be picking up again. He stood. Briggs said nothing further. In the waiting area, Monroe looked up when Emmett came out, and his expression was the expression of a man whose prediction has just been confirmed. Slater did not look up. Emmett walked into the July heat and stood beside his truck. He did not start the engine. He stood there for a moment looking at the flat white sky and thinking about a document he had read many times, and a margin note written by a man 12 years in the ground, and 5 words that had carried a different weight every time he encountered them until this particular morning, when they had finally stopped being a note and started being an answer. He started the truck. He did not turn south toward the farm. He turned north toward Amarillo. The public library in Amarillo was cool and quiet in the particular way of buildings that hold more information than anyone currently inside them needs the air, carrying the faint institutional smell of paper and binding adhesive, and the accumulated patience of books waiting to be opened. Emmett spent 3 hours at a table in the reference section with a pencil and his green notebook. He found 2 botanical reference volumes and a 1958 agricultural publication on seed crops of the southwestern United States, and he read what he had come to confirm. He read carefully and made notes in the green notebook, and went back to reread passages he needed to be certain of, not because he doubted what he was finding, but because certainty on this particular question was worth the additional time it cost. A man who orders seed on the basis of a 40-year-old carbon copy and a library visit is a man who needs to be sure of his arithmetic before he makes the call. Salvia hispanica, a drought-adapted annual documented in native stands across the southern high plains, growing in alkaline and saline soils with minimal organic content, germinating readily in the kind of surface conditions that would reject most commercial grain varieties. The plant required no supplemental irrigation after establishment in sandy loam substrate. It produced a harvestable seed crop in a late October window. Its caloric density had made it a staple food source for indigenous populations across this region. For centuries before any commercial agriculture came to the high plains, the dryland yield figures in the research documentation ranged from 12 to 22 pounds per acre, under conditions that matched in almost every particular the current profile of the northeast field. He also found in a USDA commodity bulletin from 1961 a short report on emerging markets for specialty food products in California and New York. It named chia seed as a commodity with projected domestic demand of $40,000 to $80,000 annually by 1965, and noted in plain bureaucratic language that there was zero established domestic production. All commercial supply was currently imported from Mexico, with documented inconsistency in quality and delivery reliability. The bulletin cited a distributor in Los Angeles as an active buyer seeking domestic sources. He wrote the per-pound price range in his notebook. He wrote the name and the city. He closed the notebook and held it in his hands for a moment before he put it back in his pocket, because he wanted to mark the moment not with ceremony, but with the kind of deliberate attention a man gives to a pivot point. He understands he will not be able to revisit once he moves past it. A young man at the next table was reading an agricultural magazine and looked up when Emmett closed the notebook. He asked what Emmett had been looking for. Emmett said something I already found. He returned the books to the front desk and drove home under an afternoon sky that offered nothing. The farm office was a small paneled room off the back of the house, with a metal desk and a shelf of ledgers, and a window that looked over the top of the barn roof toward the northeast field. Emmett had worked in this room since Ezra died and left it to him, and before that he had sat in the corner of it as a boy and watched his father work at the same desk, making entries in ledgers that covered every expense and every yield and every equipment, repair and every transaction the farm had conducted since the 1920s. The room smelled of old paper and the faint machine oil that had come in on work boots for 3 decades and settled into the wood. It was not a comfortable room. It was a precise room, and Emmett had come to understand the difference between those two things early in his life. He took the cracked leather briefcase from the bottom shelf and set it on the desk and opened it. Inside, in a manila envelope in Ezra's handwriting, was a 12-page carbon copy document. The typescript faded but still legible in the good afternoon light from the window. The cover sheet read, "Botanical Survey of Pre-Settlement Vegetation Patterns, Southern High Plains Region, Texas Land and Soil Commission, conducted by Norman Haas, 1924. Emmett had read this document many times over the years since finding it among his father's papers, not obsessively. The way a man returns to a thing that has not yet found its right place in the picture he is building. He had thought about it periodically in the way certain pieces of information reside at the back of a practical mind and surface occasionally when conditions approach something they describe. He had never acted on it. The conditions had never been right, or he had not been ready, or some combination of the two that amounted to the same thing. He turned now to page 4, where Haas recorded the native stands of Salvia hispanica along the seasonal playa margins in Castro Palmer and Palmer counties. He read the soil composition notes highly. Saline minimal organic matter, extreme pH variance, near zero growing season moisture. He read the yield estimate per plant, the harvest window, the observation that the plant required no supplemental water once established in the appropriate substrate. He read what he had read before, except that now every detail landed against something specific and confirmed, rather than something general and waiting. The details were not new. What was new was the year. In the margin of page 4, in pencil, in the handwriting Emmett had known since before he could form words of his own, his father had written 5 words. Wait for the right year. Emmett sat with those words for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the desk. He could hear the wind outside beginning to come up, the low, persistent sound of a summer afternoon on the high plains, carrying no moisture, serving no purpose, except to remind a man of what the air contained and what it did not. Ezra Carver had not been a man who wrote things down without reason. He had kept the green ledger for 30 years with the discipline of a man who understood that written records were the only argument that survived a courthouse. The shelf above the desk held ledgers going back to before Emmett was born, a record of this farm's entire existence in Carver hands, every entry made in the same deliberate way, nothing included that did not need to be there. 5 words in the margin of a botanical survey were not a casual notation. They were a message addressed to whoever came next, from a man who had read something and understood it, and decided the time was not yet right, and wanted someone to know the time would eventually arrive. Ezra had read this document decades ago, perhaps in the 1930s, when the dust storms were rewriting everything anyone thought they knew about this land, perhaps later. He had understood what Haas was describing. I had written 5 words and trusted them to whoever came after him. What year had Ezra been waiting for? What particular conjunction of drought and market and preparedness had he imagined when he wrote it? He had not said. He had left the words and let whoever found them supply the year. It was the kind of faith that only a man with complete confidence in the person who would follow him could sustain, the faith that the right person would understand without being told. Emmett looked at the margin note. Then he looked at the back page of his green notebook, where he had written at some point he could not precisely locate a single line in his own pencil. Salvia hispanica. No date beside it. No explanation. Just the name, as if he had written it to keep it from being lost before he understood why it needed keeping. He had been carrying the answer without knowing the question was coming. His father had taught him to do that, not in any direct instruction, but in the way of a man who writes things down and expects the writing to be read by someone who will understand why it was written. He placed the Haas document beside the notebook on the desk and looked at both of them for a moment. Then he picked up the telephone. The call went to a botanical seed supplier in Tucson, Arizona, whose information he had found in the reference section that afternoon. He ordered 720 pounds of chia seed at 18 cents per pound. Total $129.60, which accounted for nearly everything left in the household account after the July utility bill had been paid. He gave his address for freight delivery, confirmed the expected arrival, and hung up. I went to the kitchen. Mabel was at the counter with her back to the door. He told her he had placed a seed order, and he told her what it was and where it was going and on what basis he believed it would produce. He laid it out the same way he had laid things out for Briggs that morning, in plain sequence, because Mabel was not a woman who required decoration on information, and because he had learned long ago that the only honest way to tell a person something difficult was directly. She set down what she was holding. She turned halfway and looked at him. She said 60 acres. No irrigation. In July. He said the same drought that killed the ground made the ground right for this. The cracks are drainage. The depth is moisture. The conditions are what this crop needs. She stood with that for a moment. The kitchen was quiet. Through the window, the northeast field was visible in the late afternoon light, brown and cracked and giving nothing away. She looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at him. Then she said, "All right." She turned back to the counter. It was the same word she had used that morning when he left for town, but it carried something different now. Not endorsement, not confidence. Something more like a decision to stay aligned with the man she had been married to for 34 years, regardless of where he had pointed himself, because 34 years had given her a kind of knowledge of him that was equivalent to what he had of the land. She knew where his judgment came from. She knew the ledgers and the documents and the patience that had produced this moment. She did not have to understand every piece of it to trust the man who did. He went back out to the barn. Grady Locke arrived the following afternoon in a pickup with the dealer sticker still in the rear window, the truck clean in a way that farm trucks in this county were almost never clean in the middle of summer. He parked at the gate and came through with the easy gait of a man who had already run through the conversation in his head and was confident of its outcome. He was 54 years old, broad-shouldered, with the manner of a man accustomed to being the largest presence in any negotiation he entered. He ran 800 acres east of the Carver property line, and over the past 5 years he had made Emmett 3 separate offers on the northeast section, each one arriving at a moment of difficulty with the timing of a man who had been watching and waiting for the right level of pressure to produce the right result. He said, "Hell of a summer, Emmett. You doing all right?" Emmett was working on a gate hinge and did not stop. Farms standing. Locke looked at the northeast field, at the sorghum now, past saving and beginning to lean at odd angles in the airless heat. The leaves the color of old straw. He said, "I heard about your well situation. Frank Decker mentioned it at the co-op. That northeast section is going to hurt you this year. Emmett said it's going to get replanted." Locke let a beat go past. He said, "With what?" Briggs said, "You didn't take the set-aside." Emmett said, "Briggs talks to a lot of people." Locke moved a step closer to the gate and shifted his voice into the register of a man who wants to appear to be doing a favor. He said he would make an offer, before the bank did. Cash, fair market value, and a leaseback arrangement that would let Emmett continue working the ground without the debt burden pressing on him. It was the kind of offer that sounded generous until a man worked out what it actually meant, which was that the land would belong to someone else, and the man who had farmed it would become a tenant on his own acreage for whatever years he had left to farm. "The land is not for sale, Grady. I know you've got pride about it, but pride doesn't..." "The land is not for sale." Locke stopped. He looked at Emmett the way a man looks when the other man has not followed the expected script, and he made a small internal adjustment that showed in the way his jaw reset and his weight shifted back onto his heels. He was recalculating. He said, "All right, you know where I am." He walked back to the truck and left without looking back. Emmett watched the dust settle on the county road. He thought about the name at the top of Briggs' list, filed 3 days ago. He went into the farm office and wrote on a fresh line in the brown ledger, "Locke. July 14th. Third offer declined." He shut the ledger and looked at it sitting beside the Haas document on the desk. 2 pieces of paper pointing in the same direction for entirely different reasons. Then he put both away in their places and went back to the gate hinge. The seed came from Tucson by freight 4 days later. Emmett stacked the bags in the barn and spent that evening going over the WD-45. The Alice Chalmers tractor he had bought secondhand in '58 for $1,100 the year after the combine. Both machines purchased in the seasons immediately following Ezra's death, when the farm needed reliable equipment, and Emmett had spent 6 months learning what the property required versus what it could sustain. He had maintained both on the quarterly schedule Ezra had established for all the farm's equipment carried forward in the green ledger. Without interruption, the entries in Ezra's handwriting giving way to Emmett's at the exact page where the older man had stopped and the younger had continued. The WD-45 was not the oldest thing on the property, but it was the one that had never failed him. He checked the oil, the belts, the carburetor, and found everything where it should be. The machine ran the way it always ran, which was to say, reliably and without surprise, the way things run when they have been correctly maintained by someone who understands that an hour of quarterly attention costs less than a day of emergency repair. The broadcast seeder his father had built in 1939 from channel steel and a hand-cranked feed mechanism sat on the barn floor beside the tractor. Ezra had fabricated it from materials available during the war years when manufactured equipment was scarce, and a man with a welding rig and an understanding of physics could solve problems that the supply chain could not. The gate spring was the one Emmett had replaced the previous fall, noted in the ledger by part number and torque specification. He tested it with the torque wrench and found it exactly calibrated. The machine was ready. He started seeding before dawn the following morning, running the tractor at 4 miles per hour across the cracked ground in passes spaced 12 feet apart. The seed went in dry, pressed into the surface crust by the corrugated roller drawn behind the machine. He did not irrigate. He did not irrigate because irrigation was the point. The crop did not need it, and demonstrating that it did not need it was part of what the next 3 months would require him to prove, not to the county, but to himself. Because a man who claims to believe something has to be willing to act on the belief without a safety net before the belief means anything. He ran the first pass in darkness with only the tractor lights cutting a pale yellow strip across the field. The orange machine moving steadily through a landscape that would have appeared to anyone watching from the county road like a man running equipment over a field that had already failed. The work took 3.5 days. He did it alone. Mabel watched from the kitchen window in the mornings and said nothing when he came in at night. Levi was 300 miles south in Lubbock in his second year at Texas Tech, unaware that his father was seeding 60 acres of dead ground with a crop nobody in the county had ever grown. Emmett had not called to tell him. There was nothing to tell yet. There was only the work. On the second day, Wade Slater drove past on the county road and slowed his truck almost to a stop to look at the field. Emmett was at the far end of a return pass and did not wave. Slater drove on. By the third day, word had moved through the county in the way agricultural information moves in a dry summer, not through newspapers or any formal channel. but through the co-op lot and the grain elevator and the back of the feed store, quiet and steady, carrying with it the collective assessment of men who believed they knew what a failed field looked like and what a man did when he had run out of rational options. Each evening Emmett came in after dark and found supper on the stove, and Mabel already on the other side of whatever threshold she had decided to maintain for now. He ate and washed up and went back out for a final equipment check, and when he came in the second time, the house was quiet. On the last night, he came in later than usual. The final adjustment to the feed gate had taken longer than expected. He washed his hands at the kitchen sink without turning on the light. He heard Mabel move in the bedroom. She came to the kitchen doorway. She did not turn on the light. She said, "Are you done?" He said, "One more pass in the morning." She stood in the doorway for a moment, the two of them in the dark kitchen with the field invisible outside. But present the way things that matter are always present even when you cannot see them. She said, "All right." She went back to bed. Emmett stood at the sink. He looked out the window at the dark that covered the field and did not tell him anything. He dried his hands and sat down at the kitchen table without turning on any lights. And he sat there for a while in the quiet house and did not know with certainty that it would work, because knowing and working were always different things, and the distance between them was where most plans ended. He had done everything the Haas document and the library books and 32 years of reading this land had told him to do. That was not the same as knowing. It had never been the same as knowing. Ezra had understood that when he wrote those 5 words, and he had written them anyway because the alternative was to do nothing, and doing nothing was not something either Carver man had been built for. I went to bed 3 miles east on the county road behind the closed and darkened First Cattleman's Bank. Grady Locke was parked in the back lot with his headlights off. Raymond Holden stood at the driver's window in a suit jacket that was wrong for a parking lot at this hour. And both men understood that this was the kind of meeting that did not appear on any schedule. Locke told him what he had seen. Something broadcast seeded into the northeast field over 3.5 days. No irrigation lines running. Wide spacing uniform coverage across the full 60 acres. Whatever it was in the ground without water, which meant either Emmett Carver had taken leave of his judgment, or he knew something Locke did not. Locke preferred the first explanation. The second one was more troubling. Holden said, "Have you identified the crop?" Locke said, "Not yet. Ground still looks empty from the road. But he ran that tractor for 3.5 days, and he put something in." Holden was quiet for a moment. He said the note terms specify grain or approved oilseed as the primary production crop. If Carver has planted outside that classification, without prior written approval, the bank has grounds to revisit collateral compliance before maturity. Locke said, "I know what it means." Holden said, "I need confirmation. What the crop actually is. Not what it looks like from a county road." Locke said, "Give me a week." Holden walked to his own car without looking back. Locke sat alone in the dark lot for a while. The back wall of the bank building was the color of dried mud in the thin light that reached back from the street. He watched it without expression. He was a patient man. He had been patient about the northeast section for 5 years, and the 5th year was shaping into something that looked from his position like the one that would finally produce the result he had been waiting for. In the northeast field of the Carver farm, 60 acres of cracked earth held 720 pounds of seed in its fractures, pressed down by a corrugated roller into surface crust that had been prepared by 3 months of drought without any hand doing the preparing. The roots, when they came, would follow the fracture lines down to where trace moisture still persisted. At depth 4 and 5 inches below the surface, in the narrow channels the heat itself had opened. The drought had cracked the field. The cracks had become the irrigation system. No engineer had designed it. No agronomist had recommended it. A dead man's margin note and 40 years of waiting had understood it before anyone thought to ask. The green notebook on the barn shelf said, "Broadcast complete. 60 acres. Day 1. Moisture nil." Emmett had written it in pencil in the same deliberate hand his father had used in the same ledger format for 30 years before him. The cracked leather briefcase sat on the bottom shelf with a 40-year-old botanical survey inside it and 5 words in a dead man's margin on page 4. The summer held. The county waited. The ground kept its silence. And somewhere beneath the ash-colored surface of the northeast field under 3 inches of cracked earth, that everyone who had driven past it had already written off something that didn't need what everyone assumed it needed, was beginning to decide whether this was the right year. 8 days after the seeding was complete, Wade Slater drove past the northeast field twice in the same afternoon. The first pass came around 2 o'clock. His truck crawling along the county road at a speed that served no practical purpose. The northeast section showed nothing except dry ground and tractor tracks running in parallel lines across the surface. There was nothing to see. Slater looked anyway and drove on. The second pass came 40 minutes later from the opposite direction, which meant he had gone 3 miles past the farm, turned around and come back specifically to look again. Emmett was replacing a fence hinge and did not acknowledge either pass. He had been watching the county watch him for 8 days, and he had decided that the county watching him was not a problem he needed to solve. The county would have its answer in October. The next morning, Hank Monroe stopped at the end of the driveway without getting out of his truck. He sat there for a minute with the engine running, looking at the field. Then he drove away. 2 afternoons after that, a man Emmett did not recognize slowed on the county road in a sedan with a Texas plate and studied the northeast section for so long that Emmett finally stood up from the wire repair he was doing and looked back. The sedan moved on. The county had reached a collective decision without any formal meeting. It was not a cruel decision. It was the ordinary conclusion of people who had looked at available evidence and arrived at the only interpretation. The evidence appeared to support 60 acres of dead ground with tractor tracks on it. No irrigation running the note at First Cattleman's coming due in October. And a man who had walked out of the extension office without filing the set-aside form that every other producer with northeast acreage had already filed. The conclusion was quiet and preemptive and entirely confident in itself. It was the kind of consensus that forms in small agricultural counties around men who have made visible choices that appear to defy available logic. And it moved with the efficiency of a thing that has happened before in similar places and produced similar outcomes. Emmett went on with his work. He checked the WD-45 each morning and noted the oil level in the green ledger. He repaired the corral gate and replaced 2 sections of barbed wire on the east fence. He drove into town twice that week for parts and completed each errand without stopping to discuss the northeast field with anyone. In the evenings, he sat in the farm office with the brown ledger open on the desk and went over numbers he had already gone over many times. Precision was a habit, and habits were how a man kept his footing when the ground beneath him was not entirely his own. A man who stops being precise under pressure is a man who has surrendered the only advantage that cannot be taken from him. The brown ledger was the one Mabel had never seen. She found it on a Tuesday evening in the 3rd week of July when she went into the farm office looking for the crop insurance policy that needed renewal before month's end. The farm office was organized in the way Emmett organized everything, by function and sequence, with no labeling system readable at a glance, because the only person who needed to navigate the system quickly was the person who had built it. She opened the second drawer of the metal desk and found the insurance policy. Behind it sat the brown ledger, its spine unmarked, indistinguishable from the dozen other ledgers on the shelf above. She opened it because she assumed it was a financial record she had a right to see. She was correct that it was a financial record. What she had not expected was what kind. 2 columns ran down each page in Emmett's handwriting. One for the bank's stated interest figures and one for the figures the Texas banking code allowed. A third column narrower held the difference between the two. In that third column, in red pencil, Emmett had marked discrepancies across 1960, 61, and 62. Each was small enough individually to dismiss as rounding the kind of minor variance a busy man might notice and attribute to clerical imprecision. Totaled across 3 years, they added to more than $1,000 charged above the maximum legal rate. Not a rounding error. A pattern. Beside the 62 figures in the same red pencil, 2 words and a month. C. Boone, August. She sat in the desk chair and read the ledger 3 times through before she stood up. Then she read it a 4th time slowly, making sure she understood each column and what the red numbers meant in sequence. Mabel Carver had kept the household accounts for 34 years, and she knew how to read a financial document. What she read in the brown ledger was not a complaint waiting to be filed. It was a case already built. Every number annotated, every statutory reference cited every year, documented with the specificity of a man who had understood that the moment he was preparing for would require evidence that could not be questioned. She went to the barn. Emmett was adjusting the spring mechanism on the broadcast seater, checking the gate tension with the torque. Wrench the work deliberate and focused in the particular way of a man who uses mechanical precision as a form of patience. Mabel placed the brown ledger on the workbench in front of him. He put the wrench down. He looked at the ledger. Then he looked at her. She said, "What is this?" He said, "Records." She said, "I can see that." Records of what? He opened the ledger to the first marked page and explained it in plain sequence. The bank had been charging interest above the maximum rate under Texas Banking Code Section 5.0H2 for 3 consecutive years. The overcharge was small each time. Totaled it exceeded $1,000. Chester Boone in Amarillo had reviewed the ledger and the loan documents and confirmed the violation. He had filed a formal complaint with the Texas State Banking Commission on the 22nd of August. Mabel said, "How long have you known?" He said, "Since 61, when I first added it up." She said, "And you went to see Boone?" He said, "In August." She stood with the information, the way she stood with most difficult things, which was upright and still, her hands at her sides, her eyes on him, not cold, precise. Then she said, "You could have told me." He looked at her. He said, "I didn't want you to carry it before I knew it would hold." She said, "That is not your decision to make." He said, "No, I know." She looked at the ledger on the workbench for a moment. She picked it up and walked back through the barn door without another word. He heard her footsteps cross the yard in the dark and the kitchen door close. The sound of it was not a slam. It was a careful close which was in some ways harder. He stood in the barn with the torque wrench in his hand, and the quiet that follows a thing said that is both true and insufficient. He stood long enough to be certain she was not coming back. Then he picked up the wrench and returned to the spring. He had not told her because he had not been certain the complaint would reach resolution before October. Carrying a legal strategy that might arrive too late was a different kind of weight than carrying a farming decision, and he had made the distinction privately and believed it was right. Standing alone in the barn, now he understood that the distinction had been his to make and not hers, and that in making it alone he had taken something from her that should have been shared. 34 years of marriage had built between them a system of mutual accounting that he had quietly broken, and the brown ledger on the workbench had been the evidence. He put the wrench down once more. He looked at the green ledger on the barn wall, 32 years of entries in 2 different hands. He picked the wrench back up and finished the work. Raymond Holden called him into the bank on a Thursday morning in the last week of July. The meeting was in the larger conference room, which told Emmett something before he sat down. Small rooms were for conversations. Large rooms were for positions. Holden was already seated when Emmett came in. Beside him sat a man introduced as the bank's legal representative, a manila folder in front of him that he kept both hands on throughout, the posture of a man whose job is to be present as a weight rather than as a voice. Across the table, in a chair placed at an angle, suggesting presence as courtesy rather than as principle, sat Grady Locke in a suit jacket that had not been worn recently enough. He looked at the table when Emmett sat down. Holden laid out the bank's position in the measured cadence of a man reading from a prepared argument. The note terms specified grain or approved oilseed as the primary production crop. The bank had received indication that the northeast field had been planted in an unspecified crop outside the standard classification list. Without documentation confirming the planting fell within approved categories, and without evidence of viable production, the bank was in a position to revisit the note terms before its October maturity. Emmett let him finish. He reached into his shirt pocket and placed 2 documents on the table. The first was the purchase order from the Tucson seed supplier, showing the botanical classification of Salvia hispanica under the USDA Commodity Division as an oilseed crop, the same broad category as flaxseed and sesame. The second was a letter from a professor in the Texas Tech Agronomy Department noting the results of a germination trial conducted on a seed sample from an anonymous source and describing the crop's viability in conditions matching Castro County soil profiles with specific reference to dryland alkaline substrate. Holden looked at the documents. The legal representative looked at them. Neither man had expected documentation. Holden said, "This crop has no production history in this county. We have no basis to assess its yield potential or market value." Emmett said so was wheat. In 1888, the room was quiet for a moment, in the way rooms go quiet when something has been said that everyone present knows will be remembered. The legal representative looked at his folder. Locke kept his eyes on the table. Holden looked at Emmett in a way he had not looked at him before, which was the way a man looks when he understands that the person across from him is operating from a longer plan than the immediate conversation. A plan with a history and a depth that the current moment is only one part of. He said, "Come back when you have a buyer, Mr. Carver." Emmett stood and picked up both documents from the table. He said, "I will do that." He walked out. Locke had not spoken once during the entire meeting. He had sat in the angled chair with his hands flat on the table and said nothing, which was its own kind of information about what his presence had been for. The chair had been placed at an angle to suggest he was a courtesy witness, a neighbor with concern, a man there by coincidence of interest. He had sat in it and said nothing, and in saying nothing had confirmed everything. Emmett drove home without stopping. On the 18th day after the seeding, half an inch of rain fell across Castro County in the late afternoon, the first measurable precipitation since March. It came without drama and stopped without resolution, modest and temporary, a sky making a minimal gesture after months of refusal. Emmett watched it from the barn door. He watched it hit the cracked ground of the northeast field, and he watched it run briefly along the surface fractures before the crust absorbed what it could, and the rest evaporated in the residual heat. It was not enough to change anything on its own. It was exactly enough to serve as catalyst for something that had been waiting for the smallest possible permission. I went to bed at the usual hour and set no alarm. He woke at 3:58 in the morning. He dressed without turning on the light. took the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and walked out to the northeast field in the dark. The night was still and completely quiet, the sky showing more stars than it had in weeks, the air carrying the faint mineral smell of wet alkali from the afternoon's rain. At the first seeding row, he crouched and held the flashlight nearly parallel to the ground, the beam running flat across the surface at an angle that showed him what standing height could not. He was looking for a change in texture. He was looking for the difference between dead mineral surface and something that was no longer entirely mineral. Along the seam where the seed had pressed deepest into the crust, it was there. Not color, not growth, not yet. A variance in how the beam caught the soil, the slight difference in surface reflectivity between dry, cracked earth and earth where something beneath the surface had begun to move. It was the kind of sign that a man who did not know what he was looking for would walk past without noticing. Emmett had been looking for it for 18 days. He pressed his thumb against the soil at the base of the change. When he lifted it, there was moisture on the pad. Not the residual surface moisture from yesterday's rain. Something different. Something coming up. He stood. He clicked the flashlight off. He stood in the dark of the field without moving for a long moment, the dark complete around him, the field silent in every direction. He did not speak to the field or to himself or to the night. He did not need to. He turned and walked back to the house. Mabel was awake. He could tell by the quality of the quiet from the bedroom the particular difference between a house where someone is sleeping and a house where someone is lying still and listening. She had been awake when he left. He suspected and had been awake since. He put the flashlight back in the kitchen drawer. He sat at the table without turning on any light. Outside, the stars were beginning to fade in the east. After a while, Mabel's footsteps crossed the bedroom floor. She came to the kitchen doorway and stood there. He was at the table with his hands flat on the wood. Neither of them could see much of the other. She said the field. He said germinated. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she moved to the counter and filled the kettle and put it on the burner and turned on the small light above the stove. The light threw a narrow yellow band across the kitchen without reaching the table where he sat. And the two of them existed for a moment in the narrow band between that light and the dark outside. She waited for the kettle. When it boiled, she poured 2 cups and brought them to the table and sat across the corner from him. Not directly opposite, but at the angle of someone who has made a deliberate decision about proximity, who wants to be close and also to be able to see his face. He wrapped both hands around the cup. She said, Chester Boone's letter, about the banking commission. I found it when I was looking for the insurance policy. He said, I know you did. She said, you didn't tell me about that either. He said, no. She turned her cup in her hands and looked at it for a moment. Then she said, I'll bring water out at 11. To the field when you're running the rows. He looked at her. She said, 11. When the heat gets up. He said, all right. She got up and went back to the bedroom. He sat at the kitchen table until the light outside came up enough to work by. Then he went to the barn and wrote in the green notebook, germination confirmed, day 18. He sat with the pencil in his hand for a moment. He turned to the next page. He left it blank. The blank page meant something different than it would have the day before. He was not the only one deciding anymore, and the next page would require more than one kind of knowing before anything was written on it. Levi Carver drove down from Lubbock on a Friday afternoon without notice, arriving in the yard at 4:30 in the Studebaker that needed new shocks. He was 19 years old in his second year of agronomy studies at Texas Tech, and he had been looking at the manila envelope on the seat beside him since Tuesday, and had run out of reasons to wait. Emmett was behind the barn adjusting the north irrigation coupling which had developed a slow leak that wanted tending. He heard the car and finished tightening before he walked around. Levi stood in the yard holding the envelope. He was not wearing a hat. His expression was the expression of a young man who has worked out most of a problem and come home to close the last piece, the particular directness of someone who has been sitting with an incomplete answer long enough that the incompleteness has become intolerable. He held the envelope out. Emmett recognized it before he took it. He had addressed one like it from the post office in Amarillo in April, using a box number he had rented for the purpose, and mailed it to the Texas Tech Agronomy Department without a return name. Inside had been a seed sample, a soil description noting the specific chemical composition and drainage characteristics of Castro County Playa margin ground, and a single question about dryland germination viability and projected yield per acre. He said, "Your professor." Levi said, "Professor Garland." He used it as an anonymous case study in the spring semester. He ran a germination trial in simulated dryland conditions for 6 weeks, 17 to 22 pounds per acre. He told the class that whoever sent it knew their soil. Emmett looked at the envelope. The handwriting on the outside was his own, the box number in the corner, the one he had opened on a cold Tuesday in April, when the county's winter snowpack was still reading normal, and the aquifer report from March showed no critical decline and no drought advisory had been issued anywhere in this part of Texas. Levi said, "You sent it in April." Emmett said yes. Levi said the aquifer didn't go critical until June. The drought didn't peak until July. Emmett said no. Levi stood in the yard and looked at the northeast field, where 60 acres of chia now stood nearly 2 feet tall in dense blue-green rows, the flower spikes beginning to show color at the tips. The entire section transformed from the cracked and empty ground. It had been into something that looked unmistakably like a successful crop. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the WD-45 through the barn door and the broadcast cedar beside it, and the green ledger on the wall above the workbench. He said, "How long were you ready for a year that hadn't come yet?" Emmett said, "Since your grandfather died and I read what he left me." Levi held that for a moment. He had known Ezra Carver only as a photograph on the farm office wall and as the handwriting in the first half of the green ledger, and as the stories Emmett told, rarely and briefly. The way a man tells stories about someone whose example he has been trying to live up to for 30 years without being certain he has done it adequately. He said Garland wants to do a field study. He said the simulated trial raised questions he can't answer without seeing actual production in the native soil conditions. Emmett said, "Tell him to come after harvest." Levi looked at the field again. He said, "I'm staying until then." Emmett looked at him. He did not argue. He went back to the coupling and finished the adjustment. That evening, Mabel set 3 places at the table without comment, the way she had set 3 places for as long as Levi had been alive, and the way she did it suggested that the number had been correct all along, and the previous weeks of 2 places had been the exception rather than the rule. 4 days after Levi arrived on a Tuesday morning, when the chia stood full and dense and undeniably visible from the county road, Grady Locke drove past the northeast field with a passenger Emmett did not recognize. The truck slowed at the field line. The passenger had a Polaroid camera and the window down. Levi was coming through the east gate when he saw them. He walked to the road fence without hurrying the walk of a young man who has observed enough of the situation to understand what he is seeing and put both hands on the top wire. He said, "This is private property. You're standing on the county road. You can photograph the road." The passenger looked at him. He said, "Son, we're conducting a routine." Levi said, "I know what you're doing. Are you finished?" Locke was looking past Levi toward the barn. Emmett stood in the barn doorway with a wrench in his hand. He did not move toward the road. He did not call out. He stood there the way a man stands when he has already said everything that needed saying, and is simply present as a witness to whatever comes next. And the stillness of him in the doorway was its own kind of statement. The passenger took one photograph. He held the white square by its corner while it developed and showed it to Locke, and Locke looked at it for a moment. The blue-green field visible in the Polaroid's pale colors. Rows and rows of something that was clearly alive and clearly intentional, and clearly not what anyone watching from the road had predicted. Then the truck drove away. Levi came back through the gate. Emmett had already moved to the workbench. He opened the brown ledger and wrote Bank Representative on County Road. August. Approximately 10:15. Polaroid camera. One photograph of Northeast Field. He wrote the date and closed the ledger. Levi looked at the brown ledger, then at the green ledger on the wall above it. 2 ledgers for the same farm, one for the land, and one for everything that pressed against it. He did not say anything. He had begun to understand what kind of man kept them both with equal discipline and what each one was for. In the last week of September, when the chia had reached full maturity, and the purple flower spikes had set, and the seed heads were developing along all 60 acres with a density that bore no resemblance to the cracked, empty ground of July, Emmett drove to the highway and used the pay telephone at the Gulf Station. Richard Gallagher at Western Pacific Natural Foods in Los Angeles answered on the 3rd ring. He was the buyer the USDA bulletin had named a man who had been watching the emerging natural foods market with the patience of someone who understood that supply chains take time to build, and that the first reliable domestic source of an imported commodity was worth a premium. Emmett told him the expected yield, the harvest window, and the soil classification. Gallagher confirmed the price at 58 cents per pound and offered a letter of intent for the full lot freight paid pickup at the farm. Then he said, "Are you the only grower in your county?" Emmett looked west through the glass of the phone booth at the highway going toward New Mexico. The long, flat road running out to the horizon where the sky met the caprock. He said, "As far as I know." Gallagher said he would like to discuss an exclusivity arrangement. Higher per pound rate. First right of refusal on any volume Emmett produced. The domestic market for this crop was building faster than his current sourcing could keep up with, and securing a reliable domestic producer before others understood the opportunity was the kind of positioning a buyer tried to do before it became expensive. Emmett did not answer immediately. I thought about Wade Slater, who had dryland acreage east of the Pia Lakes that had produced nothing useful in 2 seasons, and who had driven past the Northeast Field twice in the same afternoon, 8 days after the seeding, looking for something he could not yet name. He thought about Hank Monroe with 200 dry acres sitting under the same sky and the same note pressure as every other small operator in the county. He thought about Gordon Briggs, who had given him wrong advice in July, not out of malice, but out of a certainty that was about to be corrected, and who would need something concrete to put in an extension bulletin so that other men had a direction. He thought about 5 words in pencil in the margin of a 40-year-old document addressed to no one in particular, trusting that whoever found them would understand that the knowledge was meant to be used and not hoarded. He said, "No exclusivity. I'll sell you what I have this year. Fair terms. But I will not shut this county out of the market." Gallagher was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right. Standard terms. Letter of intent by Monday." Emmett said, "That's fine." He hung up. He stood beside the phone booth for a moment with the afternoon sun on his back and the highway running in both directions toward the horizon. Then he got in the truck and drove back toward the farm. 3 days after the call, a sealed envelope arrived from Chester Boone in the morning mail. The Texas State Banking Commission had accepted the formal complaint and opened an inquiry into First Cattleman's Bank. Preliminary findings expected within 4 to 6 weeks. Emmett read the letter at the kitchen table. He folded it into the brown ledger. He drove into town. Not to the bank. Not to the extension office. He went to the post office on the main street and stood at the counter and addressed an envelope to Chester Boone in Amarillo. Inside was not a letter. Inside was a photocopy of the signed Gallagher letter of intent and a single page from the brown ledger. The 1962 figures. The third column, the red penciled numbers and the statutory reference. Emmett had written beside them, the first time he had worked out what they meant. No cover note, no explanation. Boone would know what it meant and what to do with it. Emmett had spent 3 months teaching him to read those numbers, and Boone was not a man who needed to be told the same thing twice. He paid at the window and walked out into the September heat. In the First Cattleman's Bank building that same afternoon, Raymond Holden sat at his desk with the Carver file in front of him. He had pulled it from the cabinet that morning after a telephone call from the bank's legal representative, and it had sat there on the desk while he worked through the rest of the day's business. The call had been about a notification forwarded from the State Banking Commission in Austin, a complaint recently accepted now under active review. The note number in the notification matched the number on the file cover in a way that was not coincidental and was not going to resolve itself conveniently. Holden placed both hands flat on the file. He looked at it for a long moment in the way a man looks at something he was not expecting to see. When he opened the drawer that morning, and then he picked up the telephone and called the legal representative back. And whatever he said quietly with the door of his office closed in the tone of a man who has just understood that the calendar he has been working from may need to be reconsidered from several months back. 3 miles east on the county road outside the Carver farm, the northeast field stood in the late afternoon light. 60 acres of mature chia, dense and blue-green and completely still in the windless September air. The seed heads full and dry and the harvest 3 weeks away, and no longer in any doubt. The same ground that had cracked open in July. The same ground that 24 people had driven past and written off before the end of that first week. What none of them had known, and what only one man in the county fully understood, was that the ground had not been waiting for the rain that finally came on day 17. The ground had been waiting for the seed, and the seed had been waiting since April in a warehouse in Arizona, addressed to a man in Castro County who had been ready for a year that had not yet arrived. The year had arrived. The harvest was coming. And in a bank building in town, Raymond Holden had just opened a file he was not going to be able to close the way he had planned. The first morning of harvest, Emmett was in the field before the light came. He had walked the rows the evening before and pressed the seed heads between his fingers and felt the dry slight give of mature grain that is ready and knows it. The smell was exactly what the Haas document had described 40 years ago. The smell of something that had completed its work and was waiting to be collected. A faint, dusty fragrance that carried a trace of the alkali soil beneath, and the particular dry sweetness of oilseed at full maturity. He walked back to the barn and ran the pre-harvest check on the combine, a self-propelled 53 Alice Chalmers that had taken 3 seasons to pay off and had not missed a harvest since. Checked the header clearance and the grain tank and the cylinder speed setting, found everything in order, and wrote in the green ledger harvest. Day 1, crop ready. Levi was up at 4:30 without being called. He came to the barn in the dark with his notebook and found Emmett already running the final check on the combine. Neither of them spoke for a while. Levi went along the near side of the machine with a rag and a flashlight and checked what Emmett had already checked, not because he doubted the check, but because this was how you learned the machine before you ran it, and they both understood that without it needing to be said. When the light came up enough to see the rows, Emmett climbed up and Levi stood at the end of the first row to watch the initial pass. The machine moved through the mature crop with the steady mechanical patience of equipment that has been correctly maintained and correctly operated, and the seed caught in the grain tank with a sound that Emmett had never heard before, but recognized immediately as the sound of something going right. A light percussion against the steel continuous, and even the sound of a crop behaving the way its documentation said it would. He ran 2 passes and cut the engine. Levi climbed up and looked into the tank. He pressed his palm into the seed and lifted a handful and let it run back through his fingers. Small, dark uniform, the faint oil between his fingers when he pressed the handful. He said, "Dry. No loss." Emmett said, "Run the next pass." Levi dropped into the operator's seat. Emmett watched from the row end while his son took the machine through the turn and down the next row, and he watched the way Levi handled the header, raising it correctly for the turn and setting it down smooth at the row entry. The small competences that take more attention than they appear to require. And he understood that the boy had been paying attention to more than agronomy lecture notes during his time away. Some things transferred without instruction, if the person being transferred to had been watching long enough. Mabel came at 11 o'clock with a canvas bag, cold water in a sealed jar, and bread wrapped in cloth and 2 apples from the tree at the corner of the kitchen garden. She set the bag at the fence post that marked the field corner and stood there for a moment, watching the combine work its way up the far row, the orange machine visible against the blue-green of the uncut crop, moving at a steady pace through 60 acres. That 3 months ago had looked like the end of something. Then she walked back without coming further into the field. The next morning she came at 11 again. The morning after that, the same. 4 days, 11 o'clock, the bag at the fence post. She did not stay. She did not comment on the yield or the pace or the machine or the weather or anything she observed. Her presence was the comment. In 34 years of marriage, Emmett had learned to read the difference between Mabel's absences and her silences, and what she was doing at 11 o'clock each morning was neither. It was a decision renewed daily to stand at the edge of something she had not been fully included in, and include herself in it anyway, on her own terms at the distance that felt correct to her. The bag at the fence post was not an accommodation. It was a statement. On the second evening when they came in and Levi went to wash up, Mabel was at the kitchen table with 2 numbers written on a piece of paper. Her estimate of the running yield calculated from the tank counts Levi had called to her from the combine during the afternoon passes. She had been tracking them from the porch. Emmett looked at the number. He said, "Close." She said, "Close to what?" He said, "What I told Gallagher in September." She looked at him for a moment. She folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket. She went back to the stove. The final yield measured at 1,140 pounds across 60 acres, 19 pounds per acre. Sitting between the 12 and 22-pound range, Garland's trial had projected, confirming the Haas document's yield estimate from 40 years before, with the precision of a thing that was always true waiting for the right conditions in which to demonstrate itself. Levi recorded it in his notebook. Emmett recorded it in both ledgers. Neither said anything about the numbers because there was nothing to say. The numbers said what needed saying. That evening, Emmett telephoned Gallagher in Los Angeles from the farmhouse and gave him the final number. Gallagher asked if he could hold the seed for 1 week to arrange transport. Emmett said he could. 4 days later, Gallagher called back. He said a second buyer had contacted Western Pacific after hearing the company had located a domestic source. He was trying to supply 2 orders simultaneously and asked if Emmett had additional seed available from this season. Emmett said, "I have what I have." Gallagher said, "Can you put in more acreage next year?" Emmett said he would consider it. He hung up and stood beside the phone for a moment, with his hand still resting on the receiver, looking out the kitchen window at the northeast field, which was brown and bare now, with harvest stubble standing in the rows, everything above ground removed, everything that mattered still in the ground doing its slow work. The truck arrived on a Saturday morning at 8 o'clock. California plates, flatbed, a driver who said very little and had brought his own certified scale. The kind of efficiency that comes from a man who has done a job enough times to have eliminated every step that does not need to be there. He weighed each of the 12 burlap sacks in sequence and entered the figures into a delivery record with the methodical attention of a man who understands that his employer's side of the transaction depends on accurate documentation. When the total matched the agreed amount, he signed the bill of lading and handed Emmett the carbon copy. Levi watched from the barn door. Mabel stood on the porch, her arms at her sides. The driver loaded the sacks onto the flatbed, secured the straps, and drove out the gate without a second visit. The tires left faint marks in the dry yard that the morning wind erased within the hour, and then the yard was empty and quiet and looked exactly as it had before the truck came, which was how it had always looked when the right thing had happened, and the world had declined to mark the occasion visibly. Emmett stood in the yard with the bill of lading in his hand. 60 acres. No water. No fertilizer. No government program. No extension office recommendation. 1,140 pounds. 58 cents per pound. Levi came out of the barn. He said, "How much?" Emmett showed him the bill of lading. Levi looked at the number and looked at his father. He said, "That is not enough for the note." Emmett said, "Not by itself." Levi said, "But you're not worried." Emmett said, "I was worried in July. By August, I was past worried." Levi said, "What were you in August?" Emmett said, "Working." He folded the bill of lading and put it in his shirt pocket and walked to his truck. Levi watched him pull out of the yard and turn not toward the house road, but toward town. Mabel came down from the porch and stood beside her son. She said, "The post office closes at noon on Saturdays." Levi looked at her. He said, "What is he mailing?" She said, "The piece of paper that opens the second door." She went back inside. Levi stood in the yard for a moment looking at the road where the truck had gone and the direction his father's pickup had turned, and he tried to calculate what he did not yet know, and found that what he did not yet know was still considerable. Emmett went to the post office and stood at the counter and addressed an envelope. Not a new letter. A final confirmation to Chester Boone that the first door had opened as planned, so that Boone would know the case was ready to close. He paid the postage and walked out into the Saturday heat and drove home. The check from Western Pacific Natural Foods arrived by mail on the following Tuesday. 1,140 pounds at 58 cents per pound. $661.20 drawn on a Bank of America account in Los Angeles on a check that had traveled 3 days from California to a kitchen in Castro County, where it now sat on the table with the full weight of what it was not. Emmett set it down flat on the table. The note balance was $14,000 plus accumulated interest. The check covered 4.5 cents on every dollar owed. Levi was at the table with his agronomy notes. Mabel was at the stove. Nobody said anything. The envelope from the Texas State Banking Commission arrived on November 7th, a Thursday in the morning mail. No preliminary letter. No phone call first. Just the envelope cream-colored typed address. State seal embossed in the corner. The kind of official mail that arrived in Castro County about one regulatory matter or another on a fairly regular basis and was most often something routine. This one was not routine. It was the result of 3 years of meticulous accounting and one attorney in Amarillo who had spent 3 months building a case out of a brown ledger, and a statutory reference. Emmett brought it inside. Mabel was at the kitchen counter. Levi was at the table. Emmett sat at the head of the table and opened the envelope the way he opened everything, with a single clean fold and no tearing, as if the document inside deserved the same care as the documents he kept. He read it once through to establish the structure. Then he read it again for the numbers. The commission had completed its preliminary review and found that First Cattleman's Bank had charged interest in excess of the maximum allowable rate under Texas Banking Code Section 5.02 in each of the years 1960, 61, and 62. The required remedy under the applicable statute was a mandatory credit to the outstanding principal equal to 3 times the total amount overcharged, 3 times $1,040. The credit to be applied to the note principal, $3,120. Applied to the current balance, the note dropped by more than 22%, in a single administrative finding accomplished not by a lawyer in a courtroom, but by a man who had been keeping accurate records for 12 years because his father had kept accurate records for 30 years before him. The bank was also assessed a regulatory fine of $750, the maximum allowed under the current code. Emmett set the letter down flat on the table. Mabel had not moved from the counter. She turned when she heard him set the paper down and crossed the kitchen and picked it up and read it. Levi watched her read it and watched her face while she did, because he understood that whatever was in the letter was the second part of something his father had been building since before the seeding, maybe since before the summer, and he wanted to see what it looked like when it arrived. She read it slower than Emmett had. When she reached the credit calculation, she stopped. She stood still for a long moment with the letter in both hands, not at the counter and not at the table, standing in the middle of the kitchen floor with the letter and whatever she was feeling about it that she had not yet decided how to hold. She set her left hand flat on the table, not for balance exactly, but the way a person steadies themselves when the floor of something has shifted. Not collapsed, but redistributed the physical acknowledgement of weight that has been present for a long time, moving to a different place in the body. Emmett put his hand over hers. 1 second. Then he moved it back. She kept reading. When she finished the second page, she folded the letter along its original crease and set it on the table in front of him. The kitchen was quiet in the way of rooms where something has just been confirmed that was half believed and fully needed, where the silence is not the absence of things to say, but the presence of something that does not need saying. Levi looked at the letter on the table and then at his mother, and did not say anything because 19 years on this farm had given him enough experience of his parents to understand the difference between silence that needs filling and silence that needs leaving alone. Mabel finally said, "You knew the commission finding would come before October." Emmett said, "I knew the complaint had been accepted." "I did not know when," she said, "but you sent Chester Boone the ledger page from the post office the week the truck came. He said to make sure the file was complete." She looked at him. "She said you were not going to tell me if it hadn't come through." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I was going to tell you everything when I could show you all of it at once." She said, "That is the same mistake you made in July." He said yes. She looked at him for a while with the particular steadiness she brought to everything that required it, and what he saw in her face was not without the cost of the previous months, not without the weight of what he had chosen to carry alone. But alongside that cost was something that had not been there in the barn when the brown ledger was on the workbench. Something that had been rebuilt not to its original specifications, but to better ones, because rebuilding after damage required decisions about what the rebuilt version needed to be that the original version never had to make. She said, "Go sign the new note." He stood. He took his jacket from the hook behind the door. She said, "Emmett." He turned. She said, Next year you tell me in April." He said yes. He put on the jacket and went out to the truck. The call from Raymond Holden had come that morning before the commission letter arrived, which meant Holden had received his copy first and had spent some portion of his morning making decisions about how to proceed with the minimum of visible damage to the institution he was responsible for. He had not mentioned the commission in the call. He had said he would like to discuss a note restructuring at Emmett's convenience, and his voice had carried the neutral precision of a man who is adjusting to a new set of conditions without advertising the magnitude of the adjustment. Emmett drove to the bank and sat across from Holden in the small conference room, the room for conversations rather than positions. The manila folder was on the table. The legal representative was not present. Locke was not present. It was just two men and a document and the arithmetic that had produced the meeting. Holden laid out the revised terms. Extended maturity to March 1st, 1964. Interest corrected to the statutory maximum and applied retroactively to the current balance per the Commission's directive. The signed contract with Western Pacific Natural Foods for the 1964 chia crop, now projected at 120 acres, accepted as supplemental collateral. Emmett read each page before signing it. He read at the same pace he read everything, which was the pace of a man who has learned that what a document says and what a man says about a document are not always the same thing, and that the discrepancy between them is most often found in the parts a person is not expected to read carefully. He signed. He took the carbon copy. He stood. Holden said, "Your son. He was in agronomy at Tech." Emmett said yes. Holden said he seems to understand numbers. Emmett said he understands more than numbers. He walked out. Through the glass of the lobby he could see Levi sitting in the truck in the parking lot, hat forward, the agronomy notebook open on his knee. Emmett got in and pulled out of the lot. Levi did not ask immediately. He had learned on this particular subject to let things arrive at their own pace. He waited until they were on the county road with the farm visible in the distance. He said done. Emmett said done. They drove the rest of the way in silence, and the silence was not the absence of communication. Word moved the way it always moved in Castro County, not through formal channels or public announcements, but through the co-op lot and the grain elevator and the back corner of the hardware store, in the patient current of agricultural communities that have no other reliable currency for accounting the outcomes of their neighbors. The California truck had been seen. The scale weights had been noted at the co-op. The figures, approximate but directionally accurate, had reached Hank Monroe through a man who had been present at the right time. Monroe found Emmett at the feed store the following week. He stood at a distance that was close enough to indicate intention, and far enough to allow retreat, the distance of a man who owes an acknowledgement and is not certain how it will be received. He said, "Heard you sold the chia." Emmett said, "Did." Monroe turned his hat in his hands. He said, "I should have asked you more in July." Emmett paid for his feed order at the counter and carried the first bag to the truck. Monroe held the door without being asked. Emmett put the bag in the bed and went back for the second. Monroe said, "Briggs is putting something together for the extension bulletin." Emmett set the second bag in the truck. He said, "I know." He drove home. There was nothing more to say to Monroe that Monroe did not already know how to say to himself. In the second week of November, on a gray Tuesday afternoon with a flat white sky and the smell of cold coming off the caprock from the west, Grady Locke's truck turned into the Gulf station on the county road. At the same time, Emmett was finishing at the pump. Neither man had arranged it. Both men understood immediately that this was the kind of timing that carries its own meaning, regardless of whether anyone intended it. Locke got out and began filling his tank. He did not look at Emmett for the first 30 seconds, He watched the numbers on the pump and did not look up. Then he said, "Your northeast section will be worth twice what I offered by 66. Emmett replaced his fuel cap. He looked at Locke across the pump island. He said, "I know." Locke kept his eyes on his own pump. He said, 23 years we've been neighbors." Emmett said, "Yeah." Locke said, "Your father and mine had an agreement about the east water easement that was never written down and never needed to be." Emmett said, "I remember." Locke turned the pump handle and looked at the numbers. He put the nozzle back. He stood beside his truck for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes on the road. A large man standing still with the particular difficulty of someone who has something to say that his habits have not equipped him to say easily. He said, "The man I sent with Holden, the one with the camera." That was a mistake. Emmett looked at him without changing expression. A long moment passed between them in the cold afternoon air, beside two trucks on the gravel apron of a Gulf station. A moment that was not forgiveness exactly, and not the absence of it either. Something that had its own word, which neither of them would have used in a public place in Castro County in 1963, but which both of them recognized for what it was. 23 years was a long time to be on the same road. What had happened in the summer could be named and set in a place where it would remain noted and understood without destroying the 23 years that surrounded it on both sides. Emmett said, "My father used to say, a man's word is the only thing a title company can't file." Locke looked at him. He held the look for a moment. Emmett got in his truck and drove out. Locke stood beside his vehicle for a while without starting the engine. He looked at the road where Emmett's truck had gone, and he sat with whatever he was sitting with in the empty lot, and then he started the engine and drove back toward his own property on the east side of the county road. The 800 acres that had not changed, and the fence line that ran between his land and the Carver land that would not change either, because the Carver name was going to stay on the mailbox at the end of the gravel drive, and both of them had known it since August, even if only one of them had said it out loud. Gordon Briggs came to the farm on a Thursday afternoon in December, on a day when the sky was the flat particulate white of the high plains in winter. The kind of sky that makes the land look more permanent than it is by draining the color from everything else and leaving only the brown and gray permanence of the earth. He drove into the yard and sat in his car for a moment. Before he got out the way a man sits when he is composing himself for a conversation he has been putting off. He came to the barn with his hat in his hand. Emmett was working on the broadcast seeder, checking the spring tension on the feed gate for the spring planting, running the torque wrench through each adjustment, in the sequence recorded in the green ledger. The same work he did every winter to have the equipment ready before it was needed. Briggs stood in the barn door and said, "I gave you wrong advice in July." Emmett set the wrench on the workbench. He looked at Briggs. Briggs said, "I didn't have the information I needed. I told you to fallow and collect set-aside, and that was wrong, and I want to say it directly." Emmett said no. Briggs said, "Where did you get it?" Emmett said, "My father had a paper from 1924. Norman Haas, Texas Land and Soil Commission, Botanical Survey of Native Species." Briggs wrote the name in his pocket notebook, carefully and completely, the way a man writes a name he intends to look up. He asked if he could see the document. Emmett went to the farm office and came back with the cracked leather briefcase. He removed the Haas carbon copy and handed it to Briggs without further comment. Briggs read it standing in the barn door with the cold air coming in around his boots and the low winter light making the faded typescript difficult, but not impossible. He turned the pages slowly the way a man reads something he understands he should have encountered before and is now reading with the particular attention owed to a thing he missed the first time. When he reached page 4, he stopped. He brought the page closer to read the margin note. He said, "Who wrote this?" Emmett, said my father. Briggs read it again. He turned to the next page and read. He turned to the final pages and read the yield figures and the soil descriptions and the harvest window notation. The 40-year-old field observations that had proved accurate to within a few percentage points. He said, I'd like to write this up for the extension bulletin. The full method. Seed source, planting rates, harvest timing, buyer contact in California. So other producers in this county have what they need when the next dry year comes. Emmett said, that is your business. He took the document back and put it in the briefcase. Briggs closed his notebook. He stood in the barn door for another moment without moving. He was working towards something that had not yet arrived at words. Emmett could see it in the particular stillness of a man who has one more thing to say and has not entirely decided to say it, but knows he is going to because he has been thinking about it too long. To leave without saying it. Briggs said, there is one thing I cannot account for. Emmett continued with the cedar. He did not respond. Briggs said the January issue of the Amarillo Globe News. Page 7. The wire story about the California market for chia seed. Someone cut it out of the library copy. I checked the archive when I was doing research for the bulletin. Clean cut straight along the column. January. Before the snowpack report in February, before the aquifer advisory in June, before any drought indication in any county in this part of the Panhandle. The barn was quiet, except for the sound of the torque wrench settling against the workbench fitting. Briggs said, in January we had a decent winter. The aquifer was within normal range. The spring looked normal from every indicator available. No one had any reason to be cutting stories about drought-tolerant seed crops out of the agricultural pages. There was no drought to react to. Emmett looked at the gate spring in front of him. He tested the tension and wrote the figure in the green ledger in the margin beside the date, exactly as specified. Briggs said, whoever cut that page was not reacting to a drought that had not happened yet. They were preparing for a year that had not come yet. A year that might not have come for another 5 years, or might never have come, but they were prepared for it regardless. Emmett set the wrench down. He turned and looked at Briggs in the barn door with the cold December sky behind him and the hat in his hands. He said January was cold. Good time to read. Briggs looked at him for a long moment. The kind of look a man gives when he has received a response that is not an answer and has decided it is as much of an answer as he is going to get, and that it is in fact sufficient. That it answers the question he was actually asking, which was not about a cut page, but about what kind of man Emmett Carver was and had always been. And the answer was this, the kind of man who cut the page in January. He said, I'll look up the full Haas archive at the state office. Write the bulletin properly with all the documentation, so other men can use it. Emmett said, do that. Briggs put on his hat and walked to his car. His footsteps crunched on the cold gravel. The car started and turned in the yard and went out the gate and south on the county road until the sound of it was gone and the barn was quiet again. Levi stepped out from the far side of the WD-45, where he had been checking the oil housing. He had been there since before Briggs arrived, working quietly on the far side of the tractor, and Emmett had known he was there and had said what he said anyway. Levi stood with a rag in his hand and looked at his father with the look of a young man who has just understood something that he has been close to understanding for weeks. He said, the January page. You cut it yourself. Emmett did not answer. Levi said, before the drought. Before any of it. You cut a story about a market with zero domestic supply, and you kept it with a 40-year-old document about a seed nobody in this county had ever grown. And you waited. Emmett picked up the torque wrench and moved to the next fitting. Levi said, how did you know 63 was the year? Emmett worked the fitting and checked the reading. He set the wrench down on the workbench and turned to face his son. He said I did not know it was the year. I did not know the aquifer would drop. I did not know the drought was coming or how severe it would be, or whether the market Gallagher represented would still exist when the crop was ready, or whether the seed would germinate in that specific ground, in that specific summer, rather than rotting in the crust, the way a different crop would have. Levi waited. Emmett said what I knew was the Haas document, and the ledger your grandfather kept for 30 years which told me how to read this land, and the ledger I kept for 12 years after him, which told me when the land was speaking and when it was only weather. 1957. I was ready. 1960, I was ready. Some years the crop conditions were not right. Some years the market was not there. 63 was the year where every piece arrived at the same time, and being ready was the difference between saving the farm and losing it. Levi stood with the rag in his hand and looked at the green ledger on the barn wall. The first entry in his grandfather's handwriting dated April 1931. The entries transitioning to his father's handwriting at the page that marked the year Ezra died. Both hands disciplined and clear, neither of them having anything to prove to anyone except the land and the record. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the notebook he had brought from Lubbock. Blue cover instead of green, but the same dimensions, the same ruled pages, the same implied commitment to recording what happened, so that whoever came after would have the record to read. He opened it to the first blank page. He said, "Garland's going to publish the field study next spring. He'll name the soil profile and the yield figures. Other growers in other counties will read it." Emmett said, "Let them read it." Levi said, "The Haas document. When Garland publishes, should it be cited by name?" Emmett said, "Briggs will cite it in the extension bulletin. Garland can cite the bulletin. The chain holds without anyone needing to know where it started. The knowledge is what matters, not the credit." Levi wrote the date in the top corner of the first page of his notebook. November 1963. He sat down on the wooden stool beside the barn door and wrote a single line beneath the date. He did not show it to Emmett. Emmett said, "What did you write?" Levi said the same thing grandfather wrote, except I wrote it to myself. The barn was quiet. Outside, the cold air moved through the gaps in the siding. Through one of those gaps, Emmett could see a strip of the northeast field. In the last of the December afternoon light, the bare stubble standing in its rows, the ground between the rows already darker than the surrounding acreage, where the root matter was building organic structure into the soil. The field did not look like a victory. It looked like a field in December. That was the point. Emmett picked up the torque wrench and finished the last fitting. He put the wrench on its hook. He closed the green ledger and turned off the work light. The barn went to the thin gray light that came through the siding gaps. He said, "Spring planting will go in the first week of April. 120 acres if the water table holds." Levi said, "I'll come back from Lubbock for it." Emmett said, "I know you will." Thanksgiving was a Thursday with cold, dry air and a pale sun that came through the kitchen windows and lay in long rectangles across the table and the floor. The particular low-angle light of late November that makes interiors look both warmer and more temporary than they are. Mabel had been cooking since early morning, and the house held the smell of it. And there were 3 places set, the way there had always been 3 places set when Levi was home, no more and no less. The table set as if this particular Thursday was entirely ordinary, which in the ways that mattered most it was. They sat down, and Emmett said what he always said before a meal, the same 4 words his father had said. And that was the grace. And it was enough. The food passed. The meal was quiet in the way that meals are quiet in families where the conversation is carried as much by the presence of people at a table as by what they say, where being together is itself the exchange that matters, and language is secondary to the fact of the 3 chairs occupied. Mabel said next year. 120 acres. Emmett said maybe more. Depends on the water table reading in April. Levi said Garland wants to bring 2 graduate students for the field study. They would work the rows and would not need the house. Emmett said they can come after planting. I want the seed in the ground before anyone else is walking the field. Mabel looked at Emmett. She said, Briggs' bulletin goes out in March. Emmett said yes. She said other men will plant it. He said that is the point of a bulletin. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her plate, and then at the window, and the northeast field visible beyond brown, and still in the November cold. Then she said your father would have wanted to see it. The kitchen held the sentence for a moment. Levi looked at his food. The low sun moved slightly in the window. Emmett looked at the field. The bare post-harvest stubble stood in its rows, the soil between showing the darker tone of organic matter that had not been there in July, the slow, visible evidence of something being built underground at a pace no one could hurry. He looked at it for a long time. He said he left me the document. That was enough. Mabel looked at the field. She said it is not always enough to be right if no one knows you were right. Emmett said, I know. She said, I'm saying he knew. He looked at her. She held his eyes for a moment with the steadiness she had brought to every difficult thing in 34 years. And in that moment he understood that she was not talking only about Ezra. She was talking about the brown ledger and the broadcast cedar, and the call she had not been included in, and the germination she had waited for in the dark. She was talking about what it meant to watch a person carry something alone, and understand the carrying without being permitted to help and to keep faith with the carrying anyway, and to bring water at 11 o'clock 4 days in a row, and not say anything because saying something was not what the moment required. He said, I know. Levi looked at his plate and was quiet. The meal continued. The sun moved in long, slow rectangles across the table, and then off the table and onto the floor. And the kitchen was warm with the smell of what Mabel had made. And outside the northeast field was cold and bare, and in the process of becoming slowly what it had always been possible to become. After Levi helped clear the dishes and then took his blue notebook to the porch where he sat in the cold and wrote for a while in the last of the afternoon light, Emmett sat alone at the table with a second cup of coffee, while Mabel washed up the water running in the sink. The ordinary sounds of the end of a meal in a house where the people in it were still present to each other. Mabel said from the sink without turning, Wade Slater came by when you were at the co-op on Tuesday. Emmett waited. She said he wants to know about planting in spring. He's got dryland acreage east of the Pia Lakes that's sitting unused. He said he should have asked you in August. Emmett said, I'll talk to him. She turned off the water. She dried her hands and turned around and looked at her husband sitting at the table where they had sat for 34 years. The man who had spent the summer carrying 2 plans at once and had kept both of them from her until the outcomes were certain, and who was also the same man who had brought her water in the dark kitchen at 4 in the morning and wrapped both hands around the cup she set in front of him. She said, you could have told Slater in August. He said yes. She said, why didn't you? He said, in August I was not certain enough of my own ground to take responsibility for someone else's. She looked at him. She said, and now? He said, now I can tell him what Briggs will put in the bulletin. Same information he could find himself when March comes. She said, but he won't find it in March. You can tell him now. He said, yeah. She said, good. She put the cloth down and went to check on the pie she had set, to cool on the back window sill. And Emmett sat with his coffee and the long afternoon light coming through the window. And he thought about Ezra writing 5 words in pencil on a page in 1924 that no one had found for 27 years, and about what it meant to leave a message without knowing who would receive it, or when, trusting only that the right person would find it and understand what it was for. He finished his coffee. He put on his jacket and went out to the barn for the final check of the day, the same check Ezra had made every evening before supper for 30 years, the one that took 12 minutes when everything was in order, and meant that everything was in order. The WD-45 was where it should be. The combine was where it should be. The broadcast seeder was on the barn floor beside the tractor. The green ledger was on the wall. The torque wrench was on its hook. He stood in the barn for a moment in the early dark, in the smell of machine oil and old wood, and the faint residual warmth of the day stored in the concrete floor. Through the gap in the siding, he could see a strip of the northeast field in the last of the light, brown and bare and useful. Not the end of something, the beginning of something different. The way the first year of a thing is always the beginning, even when it looks like it might be the end. The roots had gone down in the fractures and come back up as organic matter. And in the spring, the ground would receive the next planting differently than it had received the first, because the first had changed it, which was what the first had been for. He turned off the work light and closed the barn door and went back to the house where the kitchen light was on, and the smell of pie had reached the cold yard. In March of 1964, Gordon Briggs published a 2-page article in the Castro County Agricultural Extension Bulletin. He cited the Haas survey by name, described the planting method and the harvest results in sufficient detail for any producer to replicate them, and included the contact information for Western Pacific Natural Foods in Los Angeles. He sent a copy to Texas A&M, which reprinted the relevant section in the statewide quarterly in June. By fall of '64, 4 additional producers in Castro, Palmer, and Palmer counties had planted chia on combined acreage of 310 acres. Wade Slater harvested 630 pounds east of the Pia Lakes and sold it to a second California distributor at 55 cents per pound. He told his wife that evening that he should have listened to Emmett Carver the summer before. She said he should have. He never said it directly to Emmett. But the following spring, when the planting window opened and the ground was ready, and the seed was in the barn, he drove to the Carver farm on a Tuesday morning and stood at the gate, and Emmett came out and they talked for 40 minutes with the cold April wind coming off the caprock behind them. And when Slater drove away, he had what he had come for, and the conversation had cost neither man anything except the 40 minutes. Emmett planted 120 acres in '64 as contracted. The yield came in at 2,160 pounds at a renegotiated price of 61 cents per pound, which Gallagher had agreed to after laboratory testing confirmed that the Texas-grown seed exceeded the purity of his Mexican supply by a measurable margin. The total sale in '64 produced the first operating surplus Emmett had recorded in 3 years. He paid $2,000 toward the principal of the note in November of '64, and Raymond Holden processed the payment without comment. A Texas A&M extension study conducted in 1966 surveyed 17 High Plains farms that had transitioned drought-affected acreage to chia production. The northeast field of the Carver property, listed only by parcel number, showed the highest increase in organic matter of any site in the study. The soil composition at depth analyzed by core sample showed the structural improvement that follows several seasons of deep-rooting perennial adjacent cultivation in formerly exhausted alkaline substrate. It was a measurable, documented permanent improvement in the land. The study did not include Emmett Carver's name. He would not have wanted it to. What the study showed, if you read the soil composition tables carefully, Was this the 60 acres that had cracked open in July of 1963 under a drought? The county called historic and the bank called catastrophic, had by the autumn of 1966 become among the most productive dryland soil in the region, not because of what had been added to it, because of what had been asked of it correctly at the right time by a man who understood that the condition called ruined is sometimes only the condition called waiting described by someone who stopped looking too soon. The fractures that had seemed like damage had been structure. The depth had been drainage. The conditions that made ordinary crops impossible had made this crop inevitable for anyone who understood what the conditions were and what they were for. The Haas document lived in the cracked leather briefcase on the bottom shelf of the farm office for as long as Emmett Carver farmed that ground. It was never framed and never displayed and never mentioned in any publication under his name. When Levi eventually took over the farm, and his son after him, the briefcase stayed on the bottom shelf where Emmett had kept it, and the green ledger stayed on the barn wall with new entries added in new handwriting, and the broadcast cedar that Ezra had built in 1939 from channel steel, and a hand-cranked mechanism stayed in service maintained on the same quarterly schedule entered in the ledger by the same method. In the northeast field, the soil continued its slow work of becoming what the drought had made it possible to become. The cracks from that summer were long gone healed over by root matter and organic accumulation, and the passage of seasons that did not wait for anyone's accounting of them. But if you dug in those rows to any depth, you could find in the composition of the earth a record of what had happened there, not written in any language a man could read quickly, but present and accurate and permanent in the way that only the land is permanent, outlasting the men who farmed it, and the notes they held and the droughts they survived. The drought did not destroy the field. The drought made the field. And the man who understood that did not announce the understanding. He went to the barn, checked the oil on a machine everyone else had written off, and began.